Welcome. Thanks for joining our Research Info series, A Blind Date with Knowledge. I'm your host, Laura Brady. Today, I'm joined by Dr David Chadwick, an experienced PI and infectious diseases consultant. Hi, Dr Chadwick.
Hi.
Thank you for agreeing to have a discussion with me. So just as a bit of background, Dr Chadwick, you specialise in infectious diseases and you're really heavily involved in the research that goes on here.
Yeah.
So how long have you been involved in research?
Well, if I go right back when I was a medical student, as part of the course you were encouraged to do a project or a dissertation. This was in my third year, and I chose a lab project looking at a bacteria called Chlamydia trachomatis, which in the mid-80s was not particularly well known, but it's become a big now known as a very important cause of various diseases, and I think that sort of fired up my interest in research, and so yeah, I guess that was a long time ago, 35 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's great that it comes straight away from studying. I think to be able to see the applications and the innovation that's possible with new science, it's really important to have it alongside, or like you said, immediately as part of a career. So how did that guide you towards taking on Principle Investigator roles? What was that journey like from kind of starting in the hospital and then to taking on those roles?
Yeah, so I suppose in the meantime, like most doctors, you go through your training, and you have to decide at some point, do you want to just be a clinician, as in spend a jobbing doctor who looks after patients pretty well all the time, or do you, for a few of us, do you make that decision that you want to do research as an integral part of your job? And I made that decision, I suppose, when I was what was the SHO then, which was the stage before you go on to registrar training, and decided I wanted to do a PhD, and I'm fortunate enough to get an MRC fellowship, which gave me 3.5 years in a lab doing molecular virology work, and
very valuable time.
Yeah, absolutely, and it just showed you, how science really works, and how to read papers, how to write papers, etc.
Yeah, it's a skill in itself.
Absolutely. But at that point, you then after that I had a decision: do I stay with sort of basic science and lab-based stuff, or do I do clinical research? Because I also realised I like clinical research, and following that I did some work in Singapore with a guy who was very research active and very much saw the clinical research side as the bit I really wanted to get in on. So after that I just got more and more involved in different clinical studies, observational studies and clinical trials, and by the time I got my consultant post here, I was very keen to, in fact the post was very much designed as an academic post where it gave you that opportunity to take part in research as well as teaching as well. Yeah,
I think that's a really good thing about South Tees Trust as well. They have a lot of academic visions and the connections with different academic institutions. So I wanted to ask you, given your expansive involvement over a long time with research, do you see that there'll be any changes to overall trial conduct, kind of given the pandemic response and the adaptive trial designs that can be put into place?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's one particular study which we were very much involved in here called Recovery, which was very much a template for how to do, an adaptive trial in this pandemic setting. Yeah,
I have one of the sessions is planned on recovery. I'm going to speak to Ben Pruden at North Tees, because obviously they had a big involvement as well there. So, so what do you envisage? What does that mean for sort of trial conduct and the way that just because people might not understand from a normal trial? What are those changes? Could you spell it out for us?
Yeah, so for a typical CTIMP, which is a clinical trial of investigational medical product, in other words, a drug or vaccine trial or whatever, they do have the reputation of being really arduous in terms of all the data that you have to do, the processes you have to go through. It's quite hard to recruit patients because they have very strict criteria.
Yeah.
And it's really, for example, as a principal investigator, you often shy away from them because it's going to be a lot more work than a standard sort of observational study. But I think where recovery was quite groundbreaking was that the people who set it up realised that, if they wanted to get large numbers of people into this trial, they couldn't make it like those previous ones. They had to make it much simpler in terms of both from the point of view of consenting patients to the data that we had to put in, submit. And, I think they showed very well that you can get very large numbers of participants into trials like that if you make it as simple as possible.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've had a little bit of a spotlight as well on inclusion and representation within participant groups.
Yeah.
I think it also helps towards that. If you have an underserved group, often there are people who really rely on the results of trials but are largely underrepresented in like the participation or the recruitment processes. So I think it's good for both sides, like the scientific side and the adaptive, how they can test a lot of different like medicinal products on the same trial, but also like include many different people. So do you think there's any trials that you're currently involved with that could benefit from something like this? Do you think that it's you can transpose that sort of?
Yeah, so I think one good example of that is recovery itself, which is becoming more is widening to not just COVID but to other respiratory viruses. So, for example, there was a plan. It probably should have started by now, but it's been delayed for various reasons to include flu as the next part of recovery. So, we've got these various drugs for antivirals for flu that like oseltamivir, we've been using for years, but no one's ever really been confident from the trials that it's really, that they've never been powered sufficiently for us to be confident that these treatments are worth giving, particularly if you're paying quite a lot of money for them. Yeah. And I think you need these studies like recovery, trials like recovery, to be able to say, well, let's just, sort it out once and for all, whether it works or not, and then we can move on to some various other antivirals.
Yeah, there can be quite a lot of IMPs in that pot that will benefit from that sort of approach. So, for you, in your position, what do you think that research staff should be aware of moving forward? Is there anything, like from a trials perspective, that has been learned with these studies in terms of any sort of staff, so like from recruitment to research nurses to the lab?
So I think, one interesting thing was, I remember at the beginning of when we were just starting off recovery, it must have been March 2020, there was a sort of widespread, how should I say, skepticism about some of these treatments. So I remember talking to a diabetic consultant about dexamethasone, and he was saying, why are you giving this? Making all our diabetic patients' glucose control get much worse, and it's not going to work, is it? And out of those first 4 or 5 treatments in recovery, that was the one that worked.
I know it wasn't looking great, was it? And then it came and had a little spotlight on it. That was good.
Absolutely. So the learning was, whatever you think, you're probably going to be proved wrong. That the least expected things often become the ones that turn out to be most effective. And
that's actually a nice segue, because the name of this podcast or info series is going to be called A Blind Date with Knowledge, because that's really what research is. You don't know what you're going to find out. You have to go into things with an open mind, and I think like the recent year that's just passed has really like enabled us to open the mind again and read the science as opposed to direct it. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit as well about the campaigning that you did for HIV testing. I've heard a little bit about it, but just really about the importance of overcoming that stigma with and the danger of assumption with disease and testing. Yeah,
sure. So the background to this is that like a lot of doctors who work in HIV and infectious diseases, over the years you just see quite a lot of patients coming in presenting very late, and sadly quite a few of them dying of complications of AIDS because they present very late. And when you go back, as we do as a sort of quality improvement process, and look at what when they were attending clinics or coming into hospital in the years prior to this, you realise that they should have been tested. A lot of them should have been tested 2, 3, 4 years ago, and it just illustrates the hesitancy in the medical community around doing HIV tests, and there's a lot of stigma around it and what's called exceptionalism. And we've made a rod for our own back by making it sort of a very exceptional sort of test and needing specific consent for it. So a lot of people, it's just simpler never to do the test and not bring it up with the patient because it's less hassle. So that's what was driving this research, was how do you get around that barrier to testing people when they should be tested, according to guidelines.
Yeah, of course.
So we came up with a bit of basically some software which we realised wouldn't work particularly well in hospital, but would work pretty well in the GP systems, which basically identified from patients' records things that were risk factors for HIV, and through an algorithm put up an alert to the GPs that if the patient was there saying this patient has these risk factors, think about HIV testing. And in a pilot study we showed it worked. So increased testing rates quite a lot, and because hepatitis B and C are quite similar in terms of blood-borne viruses, which is also underdiagnosed. We included that in the software as well. So the hope is that we'll be able to improve these products, make them more user friendly for the GPs and other electronic systems, and basically make it easier for people to get tested when they should be tested, rather than not present so late.
Yeah, of course. I think as well with the software and the ability that we have now as well, it's only a matter of time before things do get really digitised, and we've got the ability to do it, especially when you think about the bioinformatics that's involved with a lot of the genome sequencing. We're really on the precipice of including that really widespread in research. But did you set up that pilot study from South Tees? Did you have a team of people, or was that? Yeah,
so I was fortunate. I managed to find a GP who was very into the record systems and the software, and was able to sort of set it up from scratch. And I was also fortunate that I managed to persuade a drug company to give me the money to do it.
That's the other setback, isn't it? You need to always wait. So do you have to source funding for many of the studies that you PI on, or do you come in as PI sometimes after there's already been a sponsor identified? How does that work?
Yeah, so for the majority of studies it's what we call commission studies, so somewhat it's either a commercial source or another funding source like MRC, Wellcome, etc., who are NIHR, who are funding it.
And we're just pools of money.
We're just joining in with lots of other centres. But I think one of the things that if you are academic and have that research bug yourself, you want to come up with your own studies and get funding, etc. So I have got a few studies that we've produced like that, including the HIV one, and currently got a COVID immunology one set up as well, which is just started.
I think it's really true what you said. If you have that academic mindset and you are passionate about research, you're naturally led to new ideas, and it guides you towards the next step. So what was the first study that you set up of your own accord? Can you tell me about that?
So that's probably, I'm trying to think how long ago. So it was probably in Singapore when it was with the help of a supervisor, but there was a particular drug which had been used in a different situation called thymosin alpha-1, and there was a sort of question that no one had ever really done anything about, which was, it might be useful for people with advanced HIV in terms of improving their immunity, stimulating parts of their immune system. So we just basically set up a small clinical trial to look at it, and got the company to fund a lot of it.
Have you seen that process change over the years, the process of setting up?
So there's the processes are much more formalised in terms of getting money out of different places, and the regulatory framework actually is a lot harder than it used to be, and in some ways it's right because it has to be done properly, but it does create quite a lot of barriers to a lot of hurdles, so you need to have a lot of time and effort to do that sort of thing nowadays.
I think that's it. It's when you're passionate about something, it's sometimes easy to forget that you do need a really big team of people. And when I started in the lab here, I thought of it kind of like a chain, and you have to be aware of what comes before and the link of the chain and what comes after. But now, after working here for a while, I feel like it's a little bit more complex than just a singular chain. It's more like a human body where you've got all these different complex systems working all at the same time over each other. So I wanted to ask a bit about the North region. So just with us being part of the Durham-Tees Valley Research Alliance, there's a big pool of participants there that could possibly be involved with studies, and we're really looking to kind of grow the research in a way that's reactive to the local needs. So can you tell me how geographical location impacts the involvement that your studies have?
So I remember someone saying a while, probably 10-15 years ago, that in terms of the actual amount of funding that comes into the northeast, and particularly the Durham-Tees Valley area, it was substantially lower than many other parts of the UK, and that's simply because London and the big academic places just take a much larger share.
I've seen the breakdowns on the website sometimes when I was researching the funding site. So
in a sense, we've always historically been very under-researched or underfunded in terms of research, and likewise you can argue that in terms of health and general well-being, that there's a lot of disease because of partly due to deprivation, industrial decline and all that sort of thing that is much higher here. Therefore there ought to be a lot more studies done, and to be fair, the NIHR is doing these sort of things like targeted health needs, where it's trying to put money into the places into the disease areas and geographical areas where we should be doing it. It's difficult to say for infectious diseases in general, because there isn't, you can't think of a particular infection or thing which particularly is worse in the northeast, but you can say with COVID, for example, because people who are more deprived tend to do worse, they're less likely to be vaccinated, they're less likely to seek medical help when they're ill, etc. That we should be doing those, and I think that's been my sort of driving force through the pandemic, is to say, well, let's just try and get our share of all these studies, the recovery, the vaccine studies, etc. coming.
See, I was driven to come to the hospital because of COVID, and what prompted me to stay was seeing some of the results of those trials, and I saw an overlay of a map of the deprived areas and the COVID infection rates, and there's a direct correlation there. That you can almost put them on top of each other in terms of socioeconomic privileged areas and those less so. So how can you tweak sort of inclusion and exclusion criteria to enable your population in trials to match the population that you aim to serve?
So I suppose if you're designing studies, you need to be aware of your local population, and I'm trying to think, it's quite difficult to think of many studies recently where we've done that,
because we're quite involved with national studies, right? So it's not necessarily tailored to us, but it does allow us to be included in those. I think with the Novavax success, they've had a bit of a spotlight on us now, so I would think that over the next few years will maybe be a bit of an opportunity to have more locally tailored studies.
Hopefully, and the other thing that's I've noticed is, if you go back 2 or 3 years, that there's a system you may be aware of where, through the NIHR, where they put out sort of expressions of interest studies that are coming through, and I'd probably get one or two a week. I get a lot, sometimes more than that now, but maybe it was 1 or 2 a month previously. And we put in lots of expressions of interest and then hear nothing back. And the gist is a lot of these drug companies or other people, they've got their sites that they like going to, and they don't like to try new sites like in the northeast that haven't been as research active. Whereas in the last 2 years, it's been very much the opposite. In other words, lots of places desperate to find hospitals that can recruit COVID patients for their new drug or their vaccine or whatever. So we've been able to be a lot more selective. And, but having said that, doing things like Novavax and recovery and showing our experience with them puts us in a better place to say, well, we've done all these studies. You may, we can do your studies because we've got all this experience which we sort of didn't have before.
Yeah, I think that was one thing that was obvious to me when I think people in the south discovered, there's an untapped potential up there. We haven't used it so far. And one side, it's not really. It wouldn't be good to sort of stay excluded from that, but we do have our own research network there, and hopefully that will be encouraging to people around the region to say, if you're involved with these trials, the results that directly affect our population in our local area, the more involved that we are, the more representation that we have in the results of those trials and in the outcomes. So I think that's it really for what I would like to discuss. Is there anything that you would say would be, to anybody listening to this podcast who is maybe thinking about discovering a little bit more about research, what's the best route sort of to do that?
Yeah, I think the key thing is to be aware that it's possible for anyone to do research. You don't have to be a doctor. You can be a lab personnel, you can be a nurse, you can be a physiotherapist. It's
almost important. We need that. We need a variation of representation in research.
And I think the key thing is to probably find someone who can mentor you and put you on the right road, whether that's just to getting involved in a trial from an experience point of view, or whether it's really going for the academic training processes that these all the professions have available to them, and it is possible to do small research studies and get yourself on that process to being a researcher through small collaborations and things like that.
Start small and build. Oh, great. Well, thank you very much.
Very welcome.
Thank you very much for listening. If you would like to engage with us about any of the content, please feel free to use the contacts listed here.